My name is Percy. I'm a house sparrow, and I have lived in the ivy along the eastern wall of Anmer Hall for 3 seasons now. I have watched foxes cross the lawn at midnight. I have seen the groundskeeper argue with a particularly stubborn rose bush every single Thursday morning without fail. I have watched rain come in from the Norfolk coast like a gray curtain being drawn slowly across the sky, and I have watched it leave again, reluctant, trailing light behind it like an apology. I have seen many things from this windowsill, but I want to tell you about a Saturday in October, a specific Saturday, the kind that does not announce itself as important, the kind that arrives looking like any other morning: gray skis, damp grass, the smell of wood smoke beginning somewhere deeper in the house, and then quietly, without any fanfare at all, becomes something you do not forget. It began at 8:30. The sitting room at Anmer Hall is not a grand room by royal standards. It is comfortable in the way that rooms become comfortable when people actually live in them rather than perform in them. There are books with broken spines on the lower shelves. There is a ceramic mug on the side table that has a small chip on its rim and has clearly been there long enough that no one notices it anymore. There is a window seat with cushions that have been sat upon so many times they have given up any pretense of holding their shape. And there is, along the far wall, a long stretch of pale plaster that on this particular Saturday morning was completely bare. It would not stay bare for long. William came in first, carrying a cardboard box, not a palace aide, not a member of staff. William himself in a gray jumper with the sleeves pushed up, carrying a box the way fathers carry boxes, slightly awkwardly, tilted to one side, trusting the contents not to shift too dramatically. The box was full of photographs, printed photographs, large ones, the kind that take a moment to absorb. Elephants standing in golden dust, a coral reef caught in a shaft of underwater light. A forest so ancient and so dense it looked less like a place and more like a feeling. He set the box on the floor and straightened up and looked at the bare wall for a moment. Then he turned toward the door. "George," he called, "we're starting." There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds, I counted, and then George appeared. He was 9 years old and he was carrying a handwritten list, and he was carrying it the way people carry things they consider important, close to the chest, slightly rolled at the edges from being gripped too tightly. He was wearing a navy blue jumper, and his hair was doing something complicated on the left side that suggested he had combed it, and then immediately slept on it again without meaning to. He looked in every possible way like a boy who had been given a responsibility and had decided, somewhere between waking up and walking down the stairs, that he was going to take it seriously. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked at the box, and then at the wall, and then at his list. "Right," he said. Not dramatically, not like a child performing seriousness. Just right, the way you say it when you have genuinely assessed the situation and found it to be manageable. William looked at him. "You're the curator today," William said simply. He said it the way you say something that is both an instruction and a gift, lightly, as though it costs nothing, which is precisely how you know it cost considerable thought. "I'll take direction from you." George looked up from his list. Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, more like the internal recalibration of a person who has just been handed more than they expected and is quietly deciding whether they are equal to it. He decided that he was. "Okay," George said. "Let's start with the forest ones. They should go on the left because the light in this room comes from the right and it'll make them look darker, which is the point." William stared at him for just a moment. "Right," William said. And they began. I settled deeper into the ivy and watched, because I am a sparrow and this is what sparrows do. We watch, we remember, and occasionally when the story is worth telling, we tell it. This story is worth telling. The photographs were extraordinary. I do not say this lightly. I am a bird. I live outdoors. I see the actual world every single day, the actual grass, the actual sky, the actual fox who I have strong feelings about and will not be elaborating on further. I am not easily impressed by pictures of things I can simply look at directly. But these photographs were different. They were the kind of images that make you understand something is disappearing, not in an abstract way, not in the way a statistic disappears, cleanly and without weight, in the way a specific, irreplaceable breathing thing disappears, slowly, quietly, and then all at once, leaving a shape in the world where it used to be. There was a photograph of a mountain gorilla sitting in green mist, one enormous hand resting on a moss-covered stone, looking at the camera with an expression that was so recognizably thoughtful it was almost uncomfortable to look at directly. There was a photograph of a Scottish wildcat, one of fewer than 300 left in existence, caught mid-step on a highland ridge, amber eyes sharp against the gray morning. There was an aerial photograph of the Amazon at a river bend, the water brown and wide and ancient, and along one bank a line where the forest simply stopped, clean as a cut, and beyond it only red earth. George held that one for a long time. "That line," he said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. William, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the box, looked up. "That line," William agreed quietly. They sorted in silence for a few minutes after that. George would pick up a photograph, study it, consult his list, and then either set it aside in a growing pile on the left or place it carefully back in the box. He had a system. The system had clearly been thought about before this morning. William, to his credit, did not interfere with it. He handed photographs across when asked and offered no unsolicited opinions, which, I have observed over 3 seasons of watching this family, is not always his default setting. The list I could see from my position on the windowsill was detailed. George had divided it into categories: forests, oceans, mammals, birds, threatened landscapes, and beneath each category he had written, in the slightly oversized handwriting of someone still making friends with a pen, which photographs belonged where and why. There were small arrows. There were crossings out. There was, in the bottom right corner, a small drawing of what appeared to be an elephant that had been added at some point, when the list-making had briefly become more enjoyable than productive. "Dad," George said, holding up a photograph of a humpback whale breaching off the coast of Iceland, water cascading from its body in great white sheets, the sky behind it improbably blue. "This one, where does this go?" William considered it. "Where do you think?" George studied it. "Center," he said. "It's the biggest, and it makes you feel something straight away. You want people to feel something straight away or they'll just walk past." William looked at the photograph, then at his son. "Center," William said. "Absolutely right." George placed it carefully at the top of the center pile and made a small tick on his list. Then William said, "We should label them so people know what they're looking at. The species, the location, what's happening to them." George nodded. He had thought of this too. The labels were on the list. "Printers in the study," William said, getting to his feet. "I'll just go in." "I'll do it," George said immediately, already standing, already moving. He was halfway to the door when he paused and turned back. "I'll need the list of labels. I typed them up last night. They're saved on," he stopped, reconsidered. "Actually, I printed a copy. It's on my desk. I'll get it." He disappeared into the corridor, footsteps quick and purposeful on the wooden floor. William stood in the sitting room alone for a moment, looking at the sorted piles of photographs, the handwritten list with its elephant doodle, the bare wall that was slowly becoming something. He smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that is not meant to be seen. "I saw it. I'm a sparrow. We see everything." 2 minutes later, George returned with his printed label list and disappeared in the direction of the study. 30 seconds after that, there came from down the corridor the specific mechanical sound of a printer making a noise that printers should not make. A pause. "Dad," George called, "it's jammed." "What were you printing?" William called back. "The nature labels," George called. The printer made another noise, a worse noise. "Of course it is," William said under his breath to no one. The printer, it seemed, had opinions about the word nature, strong ones. This would become relevant again, several times. The printer jam was resolved, eventually, through a combination of George's persistence, William's careful extraction of a crumpled piece of card that had apparently been living inside the machine since sometime in August, and a brief period during which both of them simply stood in front of it in silence, as one sometimes must. They returned to the sitting room with 6 printed labels and the quiet satisfaction of people who have defeated a small machine together. The wall was beginning to take shape. The forest photographs were going up on the left. George had found the adhesive strips in the kitchen drawer after a search that took longer than expected because someone had put them behind the measuring spoons for reasons that remain unclear. The whale was centered, waiting. The gorilla was beside it, slightly lower, which George said created a diagonal that led the eye upward, which William said he had absolutely no idea about but sounded correct. It was, by anyone's measure, going well. And then Charlotte arrived. She came in the way Charlotte tends to arrive places, not with an entrance exactly, but with a presence that immediately reorganizes the room around itself. She was wearing socks with small dogs on them. She was carrying a juice box, the straw slightly bent. She was 7 years old, and she looked at the operation underway in the sitting room with the particular expression of someone who has not been told about a project and has now decided to have extensive thoughts about it. She walked to the center of the room. She looked at the wall. She looked at the photographs on the floor. She looked at George. "Why is the whale in the middle?" she asked. George closed his eyes briefly, the expression of an older sibling confronting an eternal truth. "Because," he said with great patience, "it's the most impactful image and you want people to feel something straight away or they'll just." "It should be there," Charlotte said, pointing to the upper right corner. "That's the upper right corner." "I know. The whale is too big for the upper right corner, Charlotte." "Not that whale." She pointed at a smaller photograph George had placed in the to-be-decided pile, a mother dolphin with her calf, the water around them green and clear and impossibly beautiful. "That whale, that one should be there, because when you come in the door," she turned and pointed at the sitting room door, "that's the first thing you see, and that one makes you feel something straight away." There was a silence. George opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the door, looked at the upper right wall, looked at the dolphin photograph, looked with great reluctance at his list. "That's not a whale," he said. "That's a dolphin." "Still," Charlotte said serenely, and took a long pull on her juice box. William, who had been standing very still near the window for the past 30 seconds, with an expression of someone trying very hard not to do anything with his face, turned away at this point and appeared to study the garden with unusual intensity. George picked up the dolphin photograph. He walked to the doorway. He stood in the doorway, in the position of someone entering the room for the first time, and he looked at the upper right wall. He walked back. He picked up the photograph he had placed in the upper right position, a beautiful image of an osprey in flight over a Scottish loch, and he moved it to the left cluster. He placed the dolphin photograph in the upper right corner. He walked back to the doorway. He stood there for a moment. "Okay," he said. Charlotte nodded, as though this had never been in any doubt, and wandered over to examine the label pile. "Your handwriting on these is very bad," she observed. "Those are typed." "Oh," she considered this. "The font is bad then." "Charlotte, I'm just saying. Please don't touch those." She put down the label she had been examining. She picked up the elephant doodle list and studied it for a moment. She placed it back exactly where she had found it. "The elephant is good," she said. Then she took her juice box and drifted back out of the room with the same effortless certainty with which she had entered it, leaving behind her a dolphin in the upper right corner and a slightly rearranged understanding of the whole project. George stood looking at the wall. "She's not wrong," he said quietly. "No," William agreed from the window. "She usually isn't." George picked up his list. He made a small note beside the dolphin entry. He added Charlotte's name next to it in brackets, and then, after a moment's consideration, drew a small juice box next to that. I ruffled my feathers on the windowsill. This was going exceptionally well. I want to pause here. Not because the story stops, it doesn't. The printer will jam again in approximately 4 minutes. Charlotte will reappear briefly to eat a biscuit she claims she left in the room earlier, which no one believes. William will hold a photograph of a Scottish wildcat for slightly longer than the others, and George will notice and file it away, and not say anything because he is learning, this boy, the value of noticing without speaking. All of that is coming. But I want to pause here because I am a sparrow, and I spend every day in the actual world that these photographs are trying to describe, and I think it deserves a moment, a real one. The photographs spread across the floor of that sitting room on that October morning. Each one was a document, not of something that was, of something that still is, barely, and might not be for long. The mountain gorilla in the green mist, fewer than 1,000 left in the world. 1,000. A number so small you could fit them all in a village, and the world would contain exactly 0 mountain gorillas if that village were lost. The Scottish wildcat, mid-step on the Highland Ridge, fewer than 300 in the whole country. In a country where there is room, where there is habitat, where there was once, not so long ago, an entire population of them moving through the heather without anyone noticing because they did not need to be noticed. They simply were. The Amazon River bend with the line of red earth. Every minute the forest retreats. Every day the line advances. Not slowly in the way we have learned to tell ourselves, slowly so it feels abstract, so it feels like something happening in a different tense, in a different time, but measurably, documentably, in a way that shows up in before and after photographs taken years apart and leaves you very quiet. The coral reef in its shaft of underwater light. 30% of the world's coral reefs have been lost in the last 30 years. That number tends to sit in the mind and not move. These are the things spread across the sitting room floor. George is not. He knows some of this and is learning the rest. He is at the age where the world is still new enough that its problems feel like they might be solvable, not because he is naive, but because he has not yet been trained out of believing that they are. That training comes later. Sometimes it comes from the world. Sometimes it comes from well-meaning adults who have confused realism with resignation. It had not come yet. And William, who has spent years flying to damaged places, sitting across from people working to repair them, lending his name and his time and his genuine attention to the work of conservation, William understood something that morning that I do not think George fully understood yet. The photographs on the floor were not just images. They were arguments. And the best arguments are not made in conference rooms or policy papers or formal speeches. The best arguments are made in sitting rooms by 9-year-old curators who care enough to think about which photograph should go in the upper right corner so that people feel something when they walk through the door. The display was not for conservation. The display was conservation. Every person who walked into that sitting room and stopped for a moment in front of the dolphin photograph in the upper right corner stopped because they felt something straight away, because a 7-year-old in dog socks understood instinctively what her brother had to work out from first principles. Every one of those people would carry something away with them, something small, something that might or might not grow, but something. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. Not in grand gestures, in rooms, in photographs placed on walls by people who cared enough to think carefully about where they went. I know this. I am a sparrow. I live in the world these photographs are trying to save. The deadline arrived the way deadlines always arrive, not gradually, but suddenly, as though it had been hiding just around the corner and chose this moment to step out. Family was coming for tea at 2 o'clock. It was currently 12:47. This meant there was just over an hour left, which sounds sufficient until you account for the following. 7 photographs still without labels, 4 labels still waiting to be printed, 1 printer that had now jammed twice and was showing no signs of philosophical growth, a sitting room floor still covered in the organizational debris of a morning's work, and one George who had just discovered that 3 of his adhesive strips had been used, and he was not entirely sure where the rest of the packet was. The labels, George said. He said it the way you say things when you are staying very calm on purpose. We need to print the last 4 labels, and we need to do it now. Printers ready, William said, with the optimism of a man who had not been paying sufficient attention to the printer's track record. They went to the study. George sat at the desk and pulled up the document. The 4 remaining labels were for the Scottish wildcat, the Amazon photograph, the coral reef, and the elephant, the large, beautiful image they had saved for last. A family of elephants moving through evening light in Botswana, the dust around their feet the same color as the sky above their heads. George clicked print. The printer considered this. It's thinking, William said. It's always thinking, George said. That's not the problem. The problem is what it decides. The printer decided to jam. Not a small jam, a committed jam. A jam that required the removal of the back panel, the extraction of approximately 4 feet of crumpled paper, a brief period during which William said something quietly under his breath that George pretended not to hear, and the complete reloading of the paper tray. Right, William said, let's try again. Should we say anything out loud? George asked. William looked at him. What do you mean? It jams every time someone says. George paused. He looked at the printer. He lowered his voice. You know the word, the N word. That's, William stopped. He considered the evidence. He thought about the 2 previous jams and the precise conversational moment each had occurred. That's not how printers work. I know, George said. I'm just saying. They stood in front of the printer in silence. William reached forward and pressed print without saying anything at all. The printer hummed, paper moved, a label emerged. Then another. Then the printer stopped and made a small, defiant clicking noise. It's jammed again, George said. I can hear that. We said it again, didn't we? We didn't say anything. We thought it, George said. William looked at him. George looked at the printer. There was a silence that contained, within it, the entire complicated relationship between human beings and machines that were ostensibly designed to help them. Right, George said. He stood up. He went to the kitchen and came back with a pen, a good pen, a proper one, the kind with a solid weight to it that makes handwriting feel like more of a decision. He sat back down at the desk. He picked up the 4 remaining labels from the printed pile, blank on the back. He began to write. The handwriting was not beautiful. It was not consistent. The letters for the Scottish wildcat label started large and then got smaller as they reached the edge, as though they had realized late that space was finite. The coral reef label had a slight downward tilt on the left side that gave it the appearance of a label written on a ship. The Amazon label was the best of the 4, written slowly and carefully, each letter given its full width, because George had understood by then what the rhythm needed to be. The elephant label he wrote last. Elephant family, Botswana, African bush elephants, vulnerable status, population declining. He held it for a moment when he was done. Handwritten is better anyway, William said quietly from behind him. George looked at the label. Why? Because someone made it, William said. You can see that someone made it. That's different from a font. George thought about this. Charlotte said the font was bad. Charlotte was right. George smiled despite himself. He placed the 4 handwritten labels with the others and picked up the whole pile and carried them back to the sitting room, and they spent the next 35 minutes finishing the wall. The printer, alone in the study, made no further noise. Whether this was contrition or satisfaction was impossible to determine. The wall was done at 23 minutes past 1. They stood in front of it together, George and William, side by side in the sitting room, the photographs filling the pale plaster from just above the skirting board to just above shoulder height, arranged in the order a 9-year-old curator had decided upon after considerable thought, and one significant intervention from a 7-year-old with a juice box. The dolphin photograph was in the upper right corner. The whale was center. The gorilla looked out from beside it with its thoughtful, enormous calm. The Scottish wildcat moved through its highland mourning on the left. The forest photographs made a deep green corridor along the lower left, leading the eye inward. And at the center of the center row, not at the very heart of the display because that was the whale, but one position to the right and slightly lower, where the eye naturally traveled after taking in the whale, was the elephant family in the Botswana evening light. The dust and the sky the same color. The label in George's handwriting, slightly tilted, entirely human. It was, without question, a proper display. Not a professional one. The adhesive strips were not perfectly level. The Scottish wildcat was approximately 2 degrees off horizontal, and the Amazon photograph had a slight bow in the upper left corner where the strip hadn't quite caught. But it was a real one, the kind made by people who meant it. George looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, yeah, do you think people will actually care?" He said it in the particular way that serious questions sometimes emerge from children, not dramatically, not with the weight of someone who has been building toward the question, just directly. The way you ask something when you genuinely don't know the answer and have decided that not knowing is becoming uncomfortable. William did not answer immediately. I watched him from the windowsill. I have watched William in this garden and through this window for 3 seasons, and I want to tell you something about what I saw in his face in that moment. Not what he showed, but what moved briefly underneath it before he composed himself to answer. He knew. He had always known. Not whether people would care about the photographs. That was a real question with an uncertain answer, as all real questions have. But something else. Something that George did not yet know, and that I had been watching develop all morning from my position in the ivy. This display had not been William's idea. Or rather, it had been technically. He had suggested it weeks ago in the way parents suggest things that are actually carefully constructed scaffolding, lightly, casually, as though it were a small thing. We could put some of the conservation photographs up in the sitting room, do you think? For when people visit, and George had said, I could organize it, and William had said, that would be great, and the thing had been set in motion. But the list, the categories, the thinking about light and diagonals, and which photograph needed to be in the upper right corner, so people felt something straight away when they walked through the door. The handwriting on the labels that William had said correctly was better than a font because you could see that someone had made it. None of that had been suggested. All of that had been George. William had not needed help organizing a display. William had needed George to discover that he was the kind of person who could organize a display, who could think carefully about how art functions in a room, who could disagree with a choice, reconsider when presented with evidence, adapt a system when reality required it, and sit in front of a jammed printer and decide, without making a drama of it, that handwriting was the better option anyway. He had needed his son to find out what he was capable of. And the only way to let someone find that out is to give them the weight and step back and watch them carry it. William walked to the wall. He stood in front of the center row. He reached forward and carefully, deliberately lifted the elephant photograph and moved it, not far, 6 inches to the left, to the actual center of the display, where it should have been, where George had originally placed it before second-guessing himself 40 minutes ago and deferring to the compositional logic of the wave. He stepped back. The display changed, not dramatically, but definitively. The elephant family, the dust in the sky, the handwritten label at the heart of it now, where they belonged. People will care, William said, because you made it matter. He said it simply, not with the weight of a lesson, with the weight of an observation. George looked at the display. He looked at the elephant label with his own handwriting on it. He looked at the dolphin in the upper right corner, Charlotte's invisible fingerprints on the decision. He looked at the whole wall that had been a blank plaster, nothing 6 hours ago. "Okay," George said. Not dramatically, the same way he had said right at the beginning of the morning, when he had walked in with his list and looked at the bare wall and decided he was equal to it. Because he was. Because he had just spent a morning proving it to himself. That was the only proof that mattered. The family arrived at 2:05. There were introductions and coats, and the particular pleasant noise of people arriving somewhere warm out of a cold day. And then they came through into the sitting room and they stopped. Not all of them immediately, but one by one, as they registered what was on the wall, they stopped. One of them, a woman with gray hair and a long coat who went straight to the gorilla photograph and leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped behind her back, studying the enormous thoughtful face, stayed there for a long time. Long enough that the people around her moved on and she remained. Charlotte, who had appeared from somewhere with a new juice box, stood beside George near the door and watched the room fill with people looking at the wall. "The dolphin," Charlotte said quietly with satisfaction. "The dolphin," George agreed. He watched the gray-haired woman in front of the gorilla. He watched a man stop in front of the Amazon photograph and tilt his head slightly and then be very still. He watched a young cousin, perhaps 5 years old, perhaps 6, walk up to the elephant family at the center of the display and put one finger out and very gently touch the label, the handwritten letters, as though checking that they were real. The room had tea and conversation and all the ordinary sounds of an afternoon gathering. But along the wall, something else was happening, a quieter thing. The thing that happens when people look at something that asks them to feel something and they feel it. William came and stood beside George. He did not say anything for a moment. They both just stood and watched the room. Then William put his hand on George's shoulder, a brief, firm, quiet thing, the kind of gesture that does not ask to be acknowledged. "Good work today," he said, 4 words. George nodded. He looked at the wall, his wall, the one that had taken a list in a morning and a jammed printer and Charlotte's instinct and his own handwriting, and something in him settled. Not pride exactly, or not only pride, something quieter than pride and more durable. The particular feeling of having done something real. I watched from the windowsill as the October light shifted across the sitting room floor, and the gray-haired woman finally moved away from the gorilla, and the small cousin stayed in front of the elephant photograph longer than any adult in the room. Then I ruffled my feathers and lifted off the ivy and rose over the garden of Anmer Hall, over the damp lawn and the particular rose bush that the groundskeeper and I both have complicated feelings about, and out over the Norfolk fields going brown and gold at the edges in the October way. And I thought about a boy with a list and terrible handwriting and a dolphin in the upper right corner. I thought about a father who knew exactly what he was doing from the very first moment. He handed over the box and said, "You're the curator today," and then spent 6 hours making sure that was true. The best lessons are not taught. They are arranged by someone who loves you enough to let you believe the whole thing was your idea. Which, in the way that matters most, it was. The display stayed on the wall at Anmer Hall for 3 weeks. 3 photographs from it were later donated to a conservation fundraising auction. One of them, the elephant family in the Botswana Evening Light, with the handwritten label still attached, sold for considerably more than expected. The buyer, when asked, said it was the handwriting that did it. You could see that someone had made it. Charlotte maintains to this day that the dolphin was obvious. The printer was replaced the following spring. Percy the Sparrow is still in the ivy.